Everton are one of English football's most storied and successful clubs. In the 1986-87 season, when Everton won their 9th First Division title, finishing 9 points clear of Liverpool, they became the second most successful club in the history of English football's top flight, trailing only their Merseyside rivals. At the time, Everton were the best team in England, if not in all of Europe. Unfortunately, a ban on English teams competing in Europe prevented Everton from ever proving that point, but in the last season before the ban, the Toffees won the European Cup Winners' Cup. That was one of 8 trophies that Everton won in the space of 5 seasons, during an era in which they were blessed with the likes of Neville Southall, Peter Reid, and Gary Lineker. No team has spent more seasons in the top flight of English football than Everton, and in an all-time First Division and Premier League table, only Liverpool and Arsenal rank above them. The Toffees are still 181 points clear of Manchester United, and over 6,000 points ahead of Luton Town, who are currently 1 place above them in this season's Premier League. Everton were also one of English football's so-called Big Five, who agitated and pushed for a breakaway from the Football League, and ultimately the creation of the Premier League, so that the league's top clubs could keep more revenue for themselves. As English football rapidly modernised though, Everton were left in the dust. Within 7 years of being the best team in the land, and in only the second season of the Premier League era, Everton were nearly relegated. For the last 30 years, Everton have been fighting to rediscover their former glories. Stability arrived in the form of David Moyes, but never the ambition, modernisation, or resources required to return to their heights of the 1960s, 70s, or 80s. When British-Iranian multi-billionaire Farhad Moshiri acquired an initial 49.9% of the club's shares in 2016, there were hopes that that might change. Moshiri had formerly been a part owner at Arsenal, he had friends in high places with even deeper pockets than him, and he expressed the kind of ambition, in terms of challenging for the biggest trophies, that Everton had lacked for so long. In 2019, Everton CEO Denise Barrett-Baxendale outlined the club's vision to win cup competitions, the Premier League title, and to regularly compete in the Champions League in a world-class new stadium over the next 10 years. Since then, in the space of less than 5 years, Everton have finished 12th, 10th, 16th and 17th. They have been embroiled in 2 brutal relegation scraps. They've burnt through 4 different permanent managers, lost close to £500 million, broken the Premier League's profit and sustainability rules, been hit with the Premier League's biggest ever points deduction, their chairman has died, one fan allegedly put Barrett-Baxendale in a headlock, she and 2 other directors have stepped down, and, at the end of it all, Everton are currently in the Premier League relegation zone. Almost halfway through Barrett-Baxendale and Moshiri's 10-year vision, it would be fair to say, so far, so catastrophic. At this point, if the Everton board announced their vision to bring about world peace, you would probably be well advised to make a beeline for your nearest nuclear bunker. It's no wonder that I've been asked to make a "What on earth is going on at Everton" video even more times than Henry Kissinger was asked how he was able to sleep at night. So in today's video, we're going to try and answer that question. Not how Kissinger sleeps at night, that's not an issue anymore, RIP bozo, but how Everton have gone from being the best team in England to relegation fodder, in a semi-permanent state of crisis, why they have been handed the Premier League's biggest ever points deduction, and what might happen next. Everton might not have been title challengers under David Moyes, or anywhere close, but they had a degree of stability during the Scotsman's time at the helm that was matched only by Arsenal and Manchester United in the Premier League. Moyes inherited a team that was tied on points with Bolton Wanderers in the Premier League relegation zone with 9 games of the 2001-02 season remaining, and they were in worse form than any of the teams around them. The Toffees had won just 1 of their last 13 games, and a potentially catastrophic first ever relegation from the Premier League loomed large. Moyes won 4 of his 9 games in charge though, kick-starting what is perhaps the most underrated managerial reign of the Premier League era. Everton spent virtually nothing in net terms throughout the 2000s, at least compared to their peers, on both wages and transfer fees. But Moyes and his staff continued to pull rabbits out of the hat. After finishing 17th in the 2003-04 season, just one place above the relegation zone, Everton lost teenage sensation Wayne Rooney over the summer for a potential £27 million to Manchester United. At the time, it was the highest fee ever paid for a player under the age of 20, Rooney was still only 18, and it reflected both Everton's sporting and economic situation. In Alex Ferguson's first season at Manchester United, Everton won the league title whilst the Reds finished 11th, closer to the relegation zone than they were to the Toffees. Now Everton were powerless to prevent their greatest ever academy graduate from departing before he'd even turned 19. In the same summer that Everton sold Rooney for an initial £20 million, rising to £27 million with add-ons, they reinvested less than £2.5 million of that on new arrivals. That, combined with the Toffees' close scrape with relegation the previous season, was not only a further reminder of how far Everton had fallen, it also saw them installed as one of the three favourites to go down the following season. In one of the most impressive overachievements of the Premier League era, though, David Moyes guided Everton to a top four finish at a time when the top four of Manchester United, Arsenal, Chelsea and Liverpool were thought to be untouchable. Not until Sheikh Mansour arrived at Manchester City would another club disrupt their stronghold at the top of the Premier League table, in that case through very different means. It seemed to be just Everton's luck that in a season in which they usurped their Merseyside rivals to finish in the top four, Liverpool only went and won the Champions League. It meant that both clubs qualified for the 2005-06 Champions League, but though Liverpool would have to play 2 extra qualifying matches, they came up against Total Network Solutions from Wales, FBK Kaunas from Lithuania, and CSKA Sofia from Bulgaria. They won all 3. Manchester United, meanwhile, came up against Hungarian side Debrecen, who they thrashed 6-0. Everton, by contrast, were drawn against Villarreal, who had finished third in the previous season's La Liga, behind Barcelona and Real Madrid, and went on to reach the semi-finals of the Champions League that season, topping a group which Manchester United finished bottom of, and overcoming both Rangers and Inter Milan in the knockout stages. Everton lost both legs 2-1, therefore losing 4-2 on aggregate. In hindsight, and indeed even at the time, it felt like a bit of a sliding doors moment for the tenacious Toffees, who knew that they had punched well above their weight to finish 4th, and that it was an achievement that wouldn't be easily replicated. It was a similar story in the 1980s, of course. Had English teams not been banned from competing in Europe over the exact 5-year period in which Everton were at their absolute peak, it is quite possible, if not probable in fact, that they would have won at least one European Cup, benefiting from all of the extra prestige that comes with it. By 2005, it wasn't just the prestige that Everton missed out on when they failed to qualify for the Champions League group stage, but also vital additional revenue. One of the things that cements the gap between the haves and have-nots in the Premier League, where broadcast revenue is redistributed fairly evenly, is lucrative Champions League income. Had Everton received that windfall, perhaps they would have been able to build upon their unlikely Champions League qualification. Instead, they forged a reputation over the next 8 years under David Moyes as the perennial best of the rest. Everton recruited well, but on a very tight budget. Moyes got the absolute best out of the players that they could afford, and Everton could give pretty much anyone a tough game, especially at Goodison Park. From the 2006-07 season until Moyes' departure to Manchester United, Everton finished 6th, 5th, 5th, 8th, 7th, 7th and 6th, with the likes of Tim Cahill, Mikel Arteta, Marouane Fellaini, Leighton Baines, Yakubu and company. Everton were a good team, but that is all that they were. And there was never any genuine suggestion that they were going to be able to kick on and become more than that. In some ways, Everton were a bit of a throwback. They were owned by a local lad done good in the form of Bill Kenwright, as used to be the case at virtually every club. They had an honest and hard-working group of players, playing under a manager who was part of the furniture, and they played their home games at an intimate, sometimes raucous ground, which opened in 1892. Goodison Park might have been Everton's greatest strength in big games, especially under the lights, but it grew to be their biggest weakness from a financial perspective. It is possible, as Chelsea proved at the time, to have an ancient and not massive ground, which cannot compete with the likes of Arsenal or Manchester United for matchday revenue, so long as you have a freakishly wealthy oligarch or state actor willing to burn through stacks of his own cash in the pursuit of success. It's also possible, as in the case of Bayern Munich or Real Madrid, to be fan-owned or locally owned without requiring massive external cash injections if you have state-of-the-art arenas capable of generating enormous amounts of revenue and highly modern and professional commercial divisions. It is no longer possible, certainly not in the Premier League, to challenge for the very biggest prizes in a very old and not that large stadium with an owner who doesn't have a net worth greater than the GDP of some small to medium-sized countries. That was the exact situation at Everton, and it's one which could divide opinion among supporters. On the one hand, Everton retained an element of romance and community spirit that had been sacrificed at the altar of foreign investment at some of their rivals, but on the other hand, when you have actually been the top club within living memory, it's difficult to reset expectations to such an extent that you are resigned to no longer being able to even hope of returning to those former heights. The fact that it was Everton, arguably more so than any other club, who pushed to form the breakaway Premier League, which created those exact circumstances, ought to be lost on no one. Things changed a little for Everton in 2013, of course, when David Moyes succeeded Alex Ferguson at Old Trafford, initially bringing an optimistic 5th place finish under Roberto Martinez, followed by successive 11th place finishes, but the real change came in 2016 when Farhad Moshiri arrived at Goodison Park. Born in Iran but educated at UCL in London, Moshiri first became involved in football with his business partner, Alisher Usmanov at Arsenal. Moshiri became the chairman of Usmanov's Russian steel mining and manufacturing company Metalo Invest in 2006. Moshiri owns 10% of the firm, which has operating income in the billions of dollars. Meanwhile, Usmanov owns 60%. In 2007, the duo acquired 14.65% of Arsenal, which had risen to almost 30% by 2012, as they looked to become majority shareholders. In February 2016, though, Moshiri sold his stake in Arsenal to Usmanov in order to facilitate, both for regulatory and economic reasons, a takeover bid at Everton. It was reported that Moshiri had paid £87.5 million for his initial 49.9% stake in Everton, but on the proviso that he would plough further funds into the club on a scale that they hadn't previously seen and accelerate the Toffees' move into a new ground. Say what you want about Moshiri, like he is hopelessly incompetent, reckless, and just totally clueless about football. That is all true, but he certainly held to his word on that promise at least. The 2016-17 season was Everton's highest spending of all time, as they welcomed the likes of Yannick Bolasie, Morgan Schneiderlin, and Ashley Williams to Goodison Park. Almost £75 million was spent in total, and in the 2017-18 season, that more than doubled, as the Toffees splashed, or spaffed perhaps I should say, the best part of £200 million up the wall on signings like Gylfi Sigurdsson, Michael Keane, and Davy Klaassen. It should be said, however, that whilst Everton's spending did increase sharply between 2016 and 2018, it was in 2018 when Moshiri's business partner Alisher Usmanov accepted defeat in his battle with Stan Kroenke for supremacy at Arsenal and sold his stake to the American, joining forces with Moshiri at Everton instead, that Everton's spending really began to accelerate. At the same time as Usmanov sold his stake in Arsenal for £550 million to Kroenke, which represented a £300 million profit on his initial investment, Moshiri increased his stake in Everton to a controlling 68.6% with a built-in rise to 77.2% in 2019. Spokespeople for both Moshiri and Usmanov denied that the two were related, despite the timing, or that Usmanov had any plans to invest in Everton. But they were obviously lying. Not only were they lying, Usmanov had already made significant covert cash injections into Everton. In January 2017, USM Holdings paid £75 million to sponsor Everton's Finch Farm training ground for the next 5 years. USM Holdings is a holding company owned primarily by Usmanov, which takes the first three letters of his surname, designed to diversify his business interests and portfolio beyond his principal investment in mining steel. USM Holdings is not a public-facing company, it is a holding company, with several investments held within it, which therefore lacks any real reason for spending on advertising, let alone spending £75 million to sponsor a training ground. The idea that anyone, even if they did have a motive to advertise in football, would pay £75 million to sponsor Everton's training ground is, well, amusing, I suppose. The insurance firm AXA actually paid to sponsor Liverpool's training ground in 2018, but that was part of a broader sponsorship arrangement, which included a more important sponsorship of the Reds' training kits, and even that was only worth £20 million over 4 years, at a time in which Liverpool, unlike Everton, were one of the best and most marketable clubs on the planet. Anyway, with Moshiri's billions and Usmanov's even more billions, Everton were like a kid in a sweet shop, only with considerably less wisdom and restraint, a handful of £50 notes, and refusing to take any change. Oh, and in this analogy, they were also diabetic. The sweets were costly and very bad for them, is the point that I am very inelegantly trying to make for comic effect. In the summer of 2016 and 17, though Everton engaged in unprecedented spending sprees on some absolute dross, they had at least offset a lot of that spending through the sales of John Stones and Romelu Lukaku to the two Manchester clubs. In the summer of 2018, by contrast, the only players Everton sold for fees were Davy Klaassen and Ramiro Funes Mori, who brought in less than £20 million between them. But they still went out and spent a small fortune on Richarlison, Yerry Mina, Luca Dean, and even on a reportedly gargantuan £6.5 million loan fee to bring in Kurt Zuma. The following season was just as mental, as Everton splashed out over £100 million on the likes of Alex Iwobi, Moise Kean, Andre Gomez, and the unforgettable Jean-Philippe Gbamin. Everton weren't just splashing the cash on transfer fees, their wage bill was also ballooning at an alarming rate. The Toffees' wage bill rose from £63 million in 2013 under David Moyes, up to £84 million when Farhad Moshiri arrived in 2016, £145 million by 2018, and a truly eye-watering £183 million by 2021. Over the same period, Everton also went from spending just 58% of their turnover on wages in 2014, which was among the lowest figures in the division, to a staggering 95% by 2021, which was the second highest figure in the Premier League, exceeded only by Saudi-owned Newcastle United. When it came to transfer fees, Everton's gross spend between the 2017-18 and 2021-22 seasons was over £600 million, the sixth highest figure in the Premier League, ahead of Tottenham Hotspur and only narrowly trailing their Merseyside rivals Liverpool. Over the same period, Everton received by far the most owner funding of any team in the Premier League, as Moshiri personally, or at least ostensibly personally, pumped £681 million into the club in the form of interest-free loans, some of which have since been converted into shares. The next highest figures, at Chelsea and Aston Villa, were almost £300 million less. Moshiri is believed to have spent roughly £750 million at Goodison Park in total, excluding his investment, to acquire 94.1% of the club's shares. In the 2016-17 season, Everton were one of few Premier League clubs to turn a profit, raking in £31 million before tax. In the 2017-18 season, they lost a modest £13 million, but in 2018-19, the Toffees lost some £112 million, rising to £140 million in 2019-20, and continuing that worrying trend with a £121 million loss before tax in 2020-21. To put those losses into some context, those 3 seasons constitute 3 of the 11 biggest loss-making seasons that any team has ever had in the Premier League. Everton lost more money in the 2019-20 season than Manchester City in all but one season and Chelsea in all but two. Between 2018-19 and 2021-22, Everton lost £417 million before tax, which was by far the most of any team in the Premier League. Arsenal and Chelsea, who sustained the next highest losses, only lost £222 and £259 million respectively. Moshiri, and presumably Usmanov, saw Everton as being in a similar position to Chelsea circa 2003, Man City circa 2008, or later, Newcastle United circa 2021. A club that needed to spend on players, staff, and infrastructure in order to enjoy rapid growth, compete with the best, and start to earn like the best as well. The problem with that strategy was threefold. Well, it was really more like 17-fold, but we will just focus on the three main ones. For a start, there were no profit and sustainability or financial fair play rules when Chelsea and Manchester City's big takeovers happened, which changed the game from a regulatory standpoint. Secondly, Everton have among the lowest matchday revenue in the Premier League. Whereas Chelsea and Manchester City bring in £69 and £54 million on match days across the course of a season, Everton only generate roughly £15 million. That is partly because Goodison Park isn't massive, but primarily it's because Everton have relatively cheap ticket prices compared to their peers, and nowhere near the corporate or hospitality capacity of their rivals, which is where the real money is made on match days these days. And thirdly, the massive short-term investment at Everton might as well have been spent on an 8,000-metre tall dunce's hat to take pride of place on Moshiri's head. Chelsea and Man City had some dodgy signings back when you could get away with them due to the absence of loss regulations, but they also had a whole raft of hits. Everton only really had misses. Yannick Bolasie, even if he hadn't got injured, was never worth £25 million at 27. Gylfi Sigurdsson for a potential £45 million, even if he hadn't... well, never mind. But that was always a ludicrous fee, and Cenk Tosun, despite a friend of mine backing him to win the Premier League Golden Boot, ended up costing about £4 million for every Premier League goal that he scored during his 4 years at the club. Unlike Chelsea and Manchester City, therefore, Everton's intense spending spree wasn't rewarded with instant success or a big climb up the division. In fact, they somehow managed to get worse. In the 2016-17 season, Everton finished 7th. Since then, they have fallen to 8th, 8th again, 12th, 10th, 16th, 17th, and they are currently 18th in the Premier League table. Over the last few years, following several internal and external crises, Everton realised that Moshiri's early levels of investment were unsustainable. As soon as Everton began posting enormous losses, concerns around profit and sustainability arose, and they were exacerbated by the large amounts of capital that is being swallowed up by Everton's new stadium project, the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns, which strangled clubs' revenue streams and distorted the transfer market, and Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which led to the sanctioning of more than 100 Russian oligarchs with ties to the Kremlin by the UK government. One of those oligarchs was our old friend Alisher Usmanov, Farhad Moshiri's pal and business partner, who had gone some way towards plugging some of the gaps in Everton's finances up to that point. One of Usmanov's investments in Everton, for example, was a £30 million payment for the option to sponsor the naming rights of Everton's new stadium in 2020. No, you did hear that right. Usmanov didn't actually get or sponsor anything in return for his £30 million. He just bought the option to sponsor the new ground once it had been built. You know, just in case the training ground sponsorship wasn't already ridiculous enough. It is interesting to note that these seemingly bogus sponsorship arrangements, the equivalent of which are part of the charges levelled against Manchester City, were not and have not been levelled against Everton. The Premier League, it would seem, has no issue with Usmanov's prior dealings with the club, despite them failing to pass the smell test when it comes to fair value in the eyes of any reasonable person. It's also interesting to note that, given the nature of these deals with Usmanov, which are markedly similar to some of Manchester City's seemingly inflated commercial deals, if Everton had enjoyed any kind of success in recent years, one suspects that the sympathy they are currently receiving in light of their recent points deduction would be in much shorter supply, even if those deals weren't the reason, as is actually the case, for the points deduction themselves. Without wishing to bore you all to death, and well aware that I've covered this extensively in previous videos, the Premier League's profit and sustainability rules, often erroneously referred to as FFP, dictate that teams can lose no more than £5 million a season, plus £30 million in owner funding. So, basically, clubs are permitted to lose £35 million a season, but since the measuring period is over any 3-year rolling span, it means the actual enforceable loss is anything in excess of £105 million over any 3 successive seasons. As soon as it became apparent that Everton were likely to exceed that threshold, for all of the reasons that I've just mentioned, the club entered into close dialogue with the Premier League. Since August 2021, Everton have actually required the Premier League's regulatory approval in order to complete any transfers as part of an agreement struck with the division, which put them under special measures. To acknowledge the loss of income suffered by clubs during COVID, the Premier League relaxed their P&S rules for the 2 impacted seasons, meaning that the 2022 monitoring period assessed the 2019-20 and 2020-21 seasons as a single period. Everton claimed that, due to extenuating circumstances, they hadn't actually broken any profit and sustainability rules at all, and had only lost £87.1 million, some way below the £105 million threshold. But the financial footwork that led them to that conclusion, which was far better than any actual footwork exhibited by any Everton players over the last 10 years, understandably raised 1 or 2 eyebrows. Some of Everton's deductions, like stadium expenses, appear somewhat reasonable, due to a recent Premier League rule change which they might not have foreseen, but others appear to be a little bit more outlandish. The claim that Everton lost £212 million because of COVID, the highest figure quoted by any Premier League club, and £60 million higher than the next biggest claimant, Manchester United, seems more than a little anomalous, especially given how little Everton ordinarily generate through matchday revenue. That is child's play compared to the losses Everton cite due to the market downturn on player trading due to COVID of £88 million. Only one other Premier League club, Aston Villa, even claimed any loss whatsoever due to COVID player training, and that was just £13 million. And then there is the £10 million loss Everton initially claimed, which they could have recouped, which came as a consequence of the club not suing player X, who was suspended by the FA following a police investigation. Everton claimed not to have sued in order to safeguard player X's mental health, and they claimed that the £10 million that they could have won in court ought to be chalked off their losses as a result. Unsurprisingly, though the Premier League went along with a lot of Everton's claims, that one was pretty much rejected out of hand. Everton went back to the drawing board after the Premier League pulled them up on some of their stranger claims and came back with a figure of a £112.9 million loss, £7.9 million over the threshold. That, in of itself, was an admission of guilt on Everton's part, which is one of the reasons why this case has been resolved so much quicker than a couple of others that it is being compared with, though the Premier League still disputed Everton's own conclusions. They eventually put forward their own figure of £124.5 million, some £19.5 million above the threshold, but it has been suggested that the Commission eventually determined that the loss was £114.7 million, so £9.7 million over the limit. Unlike in the EFL, which has clear guidelines on sanctions and point deductions, the Premier League has a much looser framework, and Everton's 10-point deduction is the strictest that the league has ever enforced. Premier League Chief Executive Richard Masters told the Commission that in the Premier League's unpublished guidelines, the starting point for any breach of profit and sustainability rules is 6 points, plus an additional 1 point for every £5 million that a team exceeds the threshold by. If the Commission determined that the Premier League's figures were accurate, and Everton had gone £19.5 million over the threshold, then rounding to the nearest 5 million, the unpublished guidelines cited by Masters would appear to explain the 10-point deduction. Though much of that is speculatory at this stage. Everton were shocked by the harshness of the verdict, and began their club statement in response to it, quote, Everton Football Club is both shocked and disappointed at the ruling of the Premier League's Commission. Publicly, Everton were always likely to say as much, but I am told that those inside the club were genuinely surprised that it was 10 points. Everton had initially pushed for a financial punishment, as has been the case with clubs who have broken UEFA's FFP rules, and argued that if the punishment had to be a sporting one, it should be a transfer embargo. The Premier League Commission disagreed. On December 1st, 2 weeks after the verdict, Everton lodged an appeal with the chair of the Premier League's judicial panel. The Premier League will want the appeal to be resolved as soon as possible, given the potential implications on this season's Premier League table. There are 2 ways of viewing Everton's 10-point deduction. The club has been horrifically run, spent wildly beyond their means for at least 3 seasons, to an almost historic extent, and not only broke the Premier League's profit and sustainability rules, but knowingly violated them as far as the Commission was concerned, despite being put under special measures for the last 2 years and being repeatedly reminded of what was required of them. One could argue, based on what the Premier League and the Commission believe to be legitimate aggravating factors, and the overlooked dodgy deals with Usmanov, things could actually have been much worse for Everton. The countervailing view is that Everton, even according to the Premier League themselves, only exceeded the threshold by a maximum of £19.5 million. They were semi-open and transparent in disclosing their finances and rule-breaking, certainly more than other clubs under investigation, and they are being made an example of as the Premier League seek to illustrate that they have enough teeth to keep clubs and owners in check without requiring an independent regulator, which the government plans to introduce. There are also those who look at Everton's last 5 or 6 transfer windows, in which they have reined in their spending, compare them with clubs who have spent a fortune during that time, and determine that the punishment must be wholly unjust. That is somewhat to miss the point though. Moshiri may have turned off the taps over the last couple of years, but that is only because Everton had already had 3 of the highest loss-making seasons in the history of the league. They had been under Premier League supervision, and Usmanov's practically free money had been cut off due to sanctions. What's more, profit and loss is a 2-way calculation. It is your revenue minus your expenditure. It's not just Everton's spending, therefore, that has been an issue, it's also their relatively low revenue. Though they were one of the Big 5 back in 1992, Everton's revenue in the 2021-22 season was just £181 million, which is less than the likes of West Ham, Leicester City, and even Leeds United. Everton's revenue is now £262 million less than Tottenham Hotspur's, and just £40 million more than Brentford's. Everton and Spurs are similarly sized clubs, or at least they should be, Tottenham's only advantage in the modern era being that they are based in London. How the two have diverged over the last 10 or 20 years in terms of revenue epitomises the way in which Everton have stood still or regressed, while those around them have been modernising, professionalising, and, at least in Tottenham's case, moving into one of the most state-of-the-art and lucrative sporting venues on the planet. Everton's new Bramley Moore Dock Stadium is scheduled to open in 2024. A successful transition should provide Everton with some of the financial fuel required to compete with clubs who have run away from them in recent years and decades. But right now, there are much more pressing concerns before that move even happens. There have been warring factions at the top of the club for a number of years, and Chairman Bill Kenwright's death in October has only worsened that leadership vacuum. In September, Farhad Moshiri agreed a deal in principle with the Miami-based private investment firm 77 Partners to sell the club, which is currently awaiting Premier League approval for the takeover to be completed. Everton's financial situation is so dire, according to reports, that 777 have already offered to make the club a £50 million advance investment just to keep them going. There are also conflicting reports as to whether 777 have received initial FA approval, and there are good reasons why they wouldn't. Those 77 Partners are one of several multi-club ownership operations in football now, with the likes of Genoa, Standard Liège and Vasco da Gama all coming under their umbrella. They have also been blighted by litigation, scandals, and accusations of huge financial losses. Only founded in 2015, 777 Partners started out as a structured finance firm, but rapidly moved into the insurance, litigation, aviation, namely the buying and leasing out of planes, direct investments in airlines, property, and several other sectors. In 2018, 777 made their first move into football, acquiring a minority stake in Spanish outfit Sevilla, which they still own. 777-owned clubs have endured a mixed fate to date, over a relatively short monitoring period, but of more concern is the company's internal finances and motives. Both the New York Times and Josimar Football have reported that 777 is hemorrhaging money and heavily in debt, all while facing a series of costly lawsuits in the United States. 777 is currently seeking to raise €200 million in order to fund their football acquisition spree, and according to Bloomberg, they are forecasting further losses of €180 million across their clubs, including Everton, in 2023. Why lose money on one football club when you can diversify your investments and lose money at 7 of them across 7 different countries and 3 different continents? This is what 777 calls Project Echo. Though Everton would sit at the top of 777's portfolio, which has worked out well for some other so-called apex clubs within MCO structures, it is hard to see how the club's future is going to be better secured in the hands of a debt-laden American firm with a penchant for burning through cash, something which Everton are already very good at themselves, than they are in the hands of a man, however clueless, who is at least worth an estimated $3.1 billion. It could be a case of out of the frying pan and into the fire for the Toffees then, and as Moshiri's arrival in 2016 illustrated, things can always get worse. Either way, Everton are in serious trouble, and it is a damning indictment of English football more broadly that in the richest league in the world, one of the division's biggest and most successful clubs can still end up in such dire financial straits. In the short term, I think it's unlikely that Everton's points deduction will be overturned despite their appeal. If the Commission initially found that Everton exceeded the threshold by £19.5 million, but can be convinced that it was actually only 7.9 or £9.7 million, then a reduced deduction, likely down to either 7 or 8 points instead of 10, might be possible, as we saw at Sheffield Wednesday recently, when their point deduction was upheld, but slashed from 12 to 6 points. The silver lining for Everton, as has been widely observed, is that if there was ever a season in which to take a points deduction, it is probably this one. The 3 promoted teams are so weak this season that Everton should be able to weather a 7, 8, or even 10-point deduction and still survive. And even now, they are only 2 points from safety. Without the deduction, they'd currently be in 12th, and that is no fluke. It might have flown under the radar a little or been overshadowed by off-field events, but on the pitch, Everton have been greatly improved this season. They rank 10th in the division in terms of XG, as well as having the 8th lowest expected goals against. Even with 5 wins, 2 draws and 7 defeats from their opening 14 matches, which is a much better start to the season than many anticipated for Everton, they are currently underperforming their underlying data. Everton should still be fine this season, but after that, it's much more difficult to make any predictions. The new stadium is the lone ray of sunshine, but dark clouds loom, as Everton face legal battles from clubs who feel aggrieved to being relegated during a period in which Everton now admit to breaking profit and sustainability rules, mounting financial trouble regardless, and an ownership and leadership crisis that looks a little bit like trying to decide which car to get in to take you home after a night out if your only options as a chauffeur were Caitlyn Jenner or Stevie Wonder. Everton's motto is nil satis nisi optimum. In English, nothing but the best is good enough. In reality, Everton settled for less than the best a very long time ago, and their poorly executed attempt to return to those heights has only made them worse. Still, at least Henry Kissinger's dead, so it's not all bad news. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it. I hope that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course, goes without saying, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on for both this channel, HITC Sevens, and also my second channel, Alfie Potsama, both of which should be on or right about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might enjoy watching after this one. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, or Threads via the username at HITC Sevens on all three, should you wish to do so, and all of those links plus a whole lot more should be down in the video description below. Cheers.